Not quite. Okay. Very good. Welcome everyone in attendance today. Of course, welcome also to our next distinguished participant, speaker, Mark Jordan. We're approaching the halfway point in our rather extended series on Foucault's Confessions. Again, to repeat what I have repeated in the past, but to renew repeating for those of you who are perhaps joining us for the first time. The larger occasion of this conference, which my colleague Nikki Clements has been so extraordinarily assiduous and gifted in organizing, is Foucault's engagement with Christianity, early, shall we say, late antiquity and in some measure forward. The more specific occasion is the recent publication of his Aveux de la chair in French, and then its even more recent publication is Confessions of the Flesh in English. We have so far had presentations from James Bernauer, Peter Brown, Philippe Chevalier, all of whom have been engaged with Foucault not merely textually, but personally. We are going to move on to a number of scholars through the rest of the semester who I believe did not have the good fortune, as I did not myself, of actually meeting Foucault in person, but who have very, very seriously and compellingly engaged what he has left to us. Just to repeat again for those of you who have already joined us, and to reiterate for those of you who are visiting us now for the first time, we have asked the speaker to offer us a talk of 35 to 45 minutes in length. My colleague Nikki will subsequently moderate what questions might come in from any of you. Obviously, we're not going to have time to engage all of them, but as I think many of you know, this conference, for the most part, is being recorded. It will allow you to access the talks and the questioning period. And I think I can say that all of our speakers who are on record would be happy to engage your comments via email or through another source in the future. I won't go on because we want to leave plenty of time for our speaker. So Nikki, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, James. And welcome to Mark Jordan, who is our illustrious speaker for today. He is the Richard Reinhold Niebuhr Professor of Divinity at Harvard University's Divinity School. It's a real pleasure to welcome Mark here today within the discipline of religion, as this series is technically hosted by the Department of Religion at Rice University with the support of the Humanities Research Center, as well as the School of Humanities more broadly. But I think that the way in which we thought about this series as deeply interdisciplinary, invoking and engaging so many different discourses, and the need to really look at Foucault and Les Aveux de la chair within the framework of this rather fractal set of perspectives is nowhere best exemplified than in the study of religion, which is in itself so fractal and mystifying. So today, Professor Jordan, who is a scholar of Christian theology, European philosophy, gender studies, and an expert on sexual ethics, who's written works that have really shaped the field, including The Ethics of Sex in 2001, Telling Truths in Church in 2002, Blessing Same-Sex Unions in 2005, and then the most relevant for today, Convulsing Bodies, Religion and Resistance in Foucault. We are going to be able to dive more deeply, not only into some of the theoretical dimensions of Les Aveux, but also enjoy the deeply poetic framing of Professor Jordan. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks to our hosts, the presiding geniuses of this virtual présence. Thanks as well to the speakers who preceded me. They will hear, you will all hear echoes of what they have already said. And I apologize in advance for my voice. I believe the euphemism is husky. I actually like to think of it as the voice of a drag queen who has had a long friendship with whiskey. But what it really is just the allergy season in Dallas, which lasts from January through December. The structure of this paper is simple, even if its allusions are perhaps too dense. After a lyrical introduction, I rehearse Foucault's paraphrase of Augustine on libido in Original Sin. I then consider 4 invisible gaps in that paraphrase, 4 latent but indispensable connections to Foucault's other texts. My argument is that we cannot read HS4 well, cannot consider it complete without entering such gaps. But first, the lyrical introduction. In the 1994 Taiwanese novel, Notes of a Desperate Man, the protagonist, Xiao, must watch his childhood friend die from the complications of AIDS. Xiao is led to remember Foucault's death. He writes, "The unfinished history of sexual consciousness stopped here. Foucault appeared to have been liberated, but was not. He seemed to have found the answer, but had not. I followed him up to the lofty mountain crags, but the road ended at the edge of the sky, and there he disappeared. I shouted his name, but there was no response." For a long time, we have fantasized that we would receive our answer from the sky if only we had History of Sexuality 4. Now we have it, or rather as much as Foucault could write of what it might have been. Does this stitched together text from a frequently revised project give us an answer? If so, to which questions? We receive the text in an atmosphere still charged by the lightning of desires, whether eschatological or stigmatizing. If many longed for HS4, others anticipated it only as further occasion to smear its author as a leading cause of cultural degeneration. Foucault has all along elicited both fandom and demonization, or more precisely, heresiology, the knowingness of inquisitors. It is no surprise then that the publication of an English translation of HS4 brings yet more lip-smacking reports of Foucault's imagined crimes. And if we scholars fancy that we can dispel these phantoms of Foucault, our magical thinking has now attached itself to those boxes in Paris, to the unsealed and yet inaccessible archives, to the cloud chambers of the archival flux, as Philippe called it. Surely, surely, we should be able to extract the desired answer from those boxes. Let me speak less playfully. 2 related questions have circled through our papers so far, and they will continue in mine. The first question has to do with the limits on claims by philology or biography to fix Foucault's meaning in these pages or any others, published or unpublished. The second question has to do with the yardstick for measuring the accuracy of Foucault's interpretation of early Christian texts. The two questions ought to direct us to our presuppositions about Foucault's practices as reader and writer. I myself do not suppose that his practices can be easily grasped, in part because I believe that he adopts early on Nietzsche's untimely paradoxical challenges to all composition and interpretation. If I will put into place some pieces of text written by the body that carried the name Shao yelled to the edge of the sky, I will never suppose that the author's body possessed or wanted a single system, much less that it thought consistently or wrote literally. Now the explication of the text. I choose from the final chapter of HS4 the exposition of Augustine on the sinful libidinization of sex in paradise. I will not contest Foucault's cross-reading of a handful of Augustinian passages grouped by period, though I find that an odd way for a master ironist to read a consummate rhetorician. Instead, I accept Foucault's reading just as given in order to ask, even if his composite paraphrase of Augustine is persuasive, what importance does it have for the history that Foucault is supposed to be writing? What is the question to which this account serves as an answer? Foucault finds in Augustine's fantastical theory about lust in paradise the appearance of a desiring subject that comes to predominate in the medieval and early modern West. The subject appears when a scission, a division, rupture, separation, dissociation, I'll just call it scission, when a scission is cut by the will's choice of sinful sex. In this meta-historical event, illicit consent to sexual desire opens a rift through which the involuntary erupts endlessly within the voluntary. Subversive libido becomes a permanent feature of human life. It is a part of our sexuality, not just psychologically, but physically. By mimetic disobedience, human genitals revolt against the human will that had revolted against God. The human penis, now the phallus, becomes for each man what all sinners are towards God. Each erection is an involuntary stigma. The shameful convulsion of ejaculation, already a cause for concern in Greco-Roman medicine, now calls for more urgent bodily governance. They are so many symptoms of once and future death. The scission that divides the whole subject, soul and body, drives it towards what it does not want to desire. The involuntary is inscribed onto its entire relation with sex. Fallen sex becomes the key to our broken condition. From this emphasis on willing sex unwillingly, Foucault argues it is a short step to legal models that emphasize the relation of will to sexual desire, whether in flickering consent or the frank choice of impurity and excess. The scission of the libidinized subject issues ultimately, that is, during the European Middle Ages, in the juridification of sex. In HS2, the word juridification had been introduced in quotation marks as a very strong codification in the strict sense. Here in HS4, the word is explained as the putting into place of elements that allow one to think in juridical forms any practices, rules, prescriptions, and recommendations. Foucault offers a slightly less circular explanation when he puts warped and warping sex at the center of a juridical subject, a term with a recurring role in his histories. I'll come back to it. All right. So far, my reading of Foucault's paraphrase of Augustine. And you didn't think we were going to get out of history of sexuality without talking about sex a little, did you? So on the surface, which is all I have touched, the account might be taken to answer several familiar Foucauldian questions. For example, what is the origin of the distinctively Western notion of the desiring subject? Why is sex considered the key to who we are? And so on. It looks as if Augustine's account of original sin becomes Foucault's origin story for a certain type of Western subject. But this answer is much too tidy. The passages I've been reading are pocked by invisible gaps, gaps that another Foucault with better health or longer life would have filled in or rewritten. I speak imaginatively, of course. And if you don't like my speculations about revisions that never were, picture these textual gaps as latent connections to other texts that Foucault did write, or as notes to himself that he never had the chance to revisit. So let me begin with the simplest case of a gap, the hasty transition from the story about erupting will into the so-called juridification of medieval Christian accounts. As written, the presentation of Augustine confirms a general chronology in which earlier Christianity is typically associated with flexible relations of self to self, with arts of living, while medieval Christianity is the epoch of code, prescription, juridification. This, by the way, not incidentally, was the general narrative of the editors of the series that Foucault is using for his early Christian texts, but that's another story. Augustine stars in the narrative of decline from one to the other. So Foucault writes, by centering his analysis of concupiscence no longer on the problem of pure and impure, of soul and body, of matter and spirit, of passion and mastery over the self, but on that of the voluntary and involuntary, or more exactly, the very structure of the will, Augustine surely inscribes it within a system of juridical references. He undertakes this task to which Western Christianity will attach itself during so many centuries, and to which, or to the impossibility of which, will be due in the 16th century, the great fracture of the Reformation, namely to think the sinner as the subject of law, or as we would say in another vocabulary, to think simultaneously and in one single form, the subject of desire and the subject of law. Notice, by the way, that Foucault does here attach HS4 to the problematic of sexuality in European modernity. Whether he projected a volume 5 or not, the story of HS4 is meant to point the way to that later story. But my immediate point is that Foucault himself has already published more complex accounts of each part of the story of medieval and early modern history, not least in security, territory, population. The simple plot of a triumphant medieval system of juridical references cannot stand. Again, in the long introduction to HS2, Foucault insists that the contrast between code morality and ethics is not a binary, since every complex moral teaching contains elements of both. So even if Western Christianity succumbed over centuries to sexual codification, a more interesting question, a more Foucauldian question would be, where in those same medieval texts can we see the intrinsic elements that resist code, the alternate arts of existence or self-stylization that are elicited by the very attempt to tighten juridical power? And as you know, these are what Foucault calls elsewhere the counterconducts. But we needn't look beyond HS4 to find texts that should be attached to the retelling of Augustine as complications. Consider what is called Annex 2 in the edition of HS4. To be honest, I find this the most interesting portion of the published volume. Its detachment from the main text suggests to me that Foucault was hardly finished with the volume structure. In this annex, Foucault not only relativizes his historical contrast, he explicitly sets aside the temptation to endorse any causal chronology. He writes, "Let us forget for a moment context and chronologies." He says something like that so many times in the lectures at the Collège de France. Let us forget for a moment context and chronologies. He then proceeds to lay out what he takes to be the logic of the image of the shepherd. Then he adds, "I know that I have mixed against all method very disparate things." Foucault's reading of Augustine on libido seems to be another exploration of the logic of an image, the image of the will divided against itself. I believe that it too, that the annex actually abandons context and chronologies. It violates the guild standard methods by its mixture of disparate things, not least by introducing so many latent connections to Foucault's other stories and other characters, which is why it is so odd that Foucault drops the Augustinian paraphrase back into intellectual history. It would be more responsible to say that Foucault shows how he can construct a history of our present in which some Augustinian texts offer an early interpretation of the logic of an image that returns through the mutations of power. When Foucault writes, "With Augustine, one enters into a sexual morality centered on a juridical subject," he must mean that the entryway stands open for us as we write a history of our present, as we search for antecedent forms of resistance. Which brings me to the second gap, the return of the juridical subject. The juridical subject, as I've said, is a recurring character in Foucault's text. We meet it in many places, but perhaps most infamously in the distinction between the sodomite and the homosexual from HS1, which passage was, for too many American readers, the port of entry for a first visit to Foucault. You know the passage I mean, the one that begins, "As defined by the ancient civil or canonical codes, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their perpetrator was nothing more than the juridical subject of them. By contrast, the 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood." It goes on. I'm tempted to ask for a group recitation of this passage, but I forbear. Now, most readers ignore the sodomite to reach the homosexual. I confess that I like to linger with the sodomite because if we have to label ourselves, there's a lot to be said for a label that is incoherently capacious, confusingly anti-gendered, possessed of a frankly mythological backstory, and deeply theological. But wherever you like to linger, please note that in the passage from HS1, the central contrast is between the sodomite as juridical subject of forbidden acts and the homosexual as a medicalized personage. The contrast finds a parallel in Foucault's lectures on abnormals. There he argues that one function of 19th century psychiatric expertise is to double the author of the offense with a new personage of the delinquent, previously unknown to the 18th century. Given the resemblance of the two passages, we might combine them to say the personage of the homosexual creates an ethico-moral double, an individual who is the bearer of a character with specified traits, rather than the juridical subject of a legally defined offense. But of course, the juridical subject of the sodomite before biopower was itself the creation and target of civil and church laws. It was not, to be sure, the same kind of character as biopower's homosexual, but it is a character meant to group bodies for analysis, correction, and punishment. It supplied a set of scripts so that bodies would talk about themselves in certain ways. Inquisitorial records or confessional manuals are very concerned that sodomites perform certain roles before being executed. The juridical subject is the projection of a legal code, if you like, but it is also a character that needs to be inhabited by breathing bodies. The juridical subject brings the body within a certain regime of truth, but it also thus risks the stability of the regime on the obedience of that body. The body might, after all, convulse or otherwise disobey, or somehow split the field of power that is being enforced. Foucault again, with Augustine, one enters into a sexual morality centered on a juridical subject. But that particular juridical subject is marked by a split, the constitutive feature of the logic of this image that Foucault explores. The longer we meditate on that unstable split, the more we see that other texts by Foucault are to be attached just here. My next example. The first time I read these pages on sin and split subject in Augustine, my hands trembling to be actually holding HS4 as a printed volume in French. The first time I read these pages, the word that leapt out at me was partage, usually translated as division. Foucault uses this noun or its verb at several crucial moments when explicating Augustine. For example, it is a partage that divides the pristine creation from sinful fall. What is more interesting, Foucault uses the verb partager to explain the action that produces the cut, that divides self against self. The resulting partage is not a border separating two spatial regions. It is the co-presence of an act and its negation, of life and the impulse to death. In human sex, especially, the effect of division called libido doubles every sexual act, revealing the split, dividing the whole subject, the scission, partageant the whole subject. Partage is a charmed word for the body that writes under the name Michel Foucault. He borrows it from René Char in the original preface to History of Madness, when meditating on how to write reason's efforts to enclose madness in silence. Remember, by the way, that a quotation from the poet Char appears alone on the back covers of HS2, HS3, and HS4. In Foucault's diction, partage is linked to clusters of other words, but especially to notions of doubling, a word you have also heard in his paraphrase of Augustine. In Foucault, the mutations of power can be traced by the doubles they make. Some poets or philosophers are doubled as mad, the unusual is doubled as the abnormal, the offender is doubled as the delinquent, and so on. More pertinently for HS4, Foucault had much earlier described the doubling of the body as the flesh, hence his original title for a volume of HS on Christian confession. So now, Foucault finds an Augustine story about lust in paradise, the doubling of all human sex by libido. Partage, doubling, what kinds of philosophical or theological narratives can persuasively depict such operations? In HS4, Foucault calls Augustine's story of the will's partage meta-historical or trans-historical. Whatever those words mean, they caution us against misreading these pages as ordinary historiography. Standard history cannot portray the events of partage, the multiplying of doubles that are the main motives of Foucault's stories. Elsewhere, Foucault shows himself fascinated by the undoing of sequential narrative, not only in history writing, but in certain poems, novels, experiences of madness, religious visions. But even here, in the piece of HS4 on Augustine, part of Foucault's fascination with the account of original sin is that it occurs on a level of storytelling uncannily familiar to him. The partage of the will is both an effect of a human choice and an inherited punishment decreed by an eternal God. Foucault is interested in that punishment because it connects Augustine's story to later judicial fictions. But he is even more interested, I believe, in the way that Augustine's story meets and reverses his own usual sequence of storytelling. One example, in Foucault's partage of the mad, madness is in one sense constituted as a category by reason. In another sense, the bodies called mad were already there, though explained and tended in other ways. For Augustine's story, reason really is first, divine reason, and then human reason. It fills all the spaces in every human subject, soul and body. When human subjects split themselves by rejecting God, God punishes them by allowing the consequences of their rebellion to persist for the time we call history, and for some, namely the damned, beyond history. But the story of Eden is the original case history, before which there is no human subject. Whereas in Foucault, there is always a before. And what each new power performs as its creative division is in fact a violent expulsion or smothering confinement that attempts to subdue whatever it has inherited as the uncontrollable. Augustine's narration of the fall may be the origin of libidinized subjectivity, but it is also just another version of power's favorite story. Which brings us to the last invisible gap I'll mention, the last latent connection to other texts. If Foucault's official point in HS4 is to provide a genealogy for ongoing verbal reports of life as a split will, his pages on Augustine betray a certain affection for the speechless possibilities of bodily rebellion. Foucault likes to make plain what Augustine keeps trying to conceal, namely erections. However many times Augustine swears that there are involuntary somatic rebellions in women too, if only their blushes for men, Foucault returns to erections, not for the reasons that a certain sort of biographer might fantasize, but because Foucault is interested in how the visibility of bodily resistance muddles the official scripts dictated by codes of law and forensic medicine for their juridical subjects. At one point, Foucault refers to erection as a spectacle. It is, he says later, seeable and unforeseeable. In such phrases, he almost cites his many discussions of bodily theater. Earlier in HS4, he has rehearsed once again the penitential displays of silent bodies for which the Roman matron Fabiola is his preferred emblem. She appears in the manuscript's pages devoted to competing procedures of Christian penance. Foucault summarizes the differences along several axes, most notably one that runs from the juridical to the dramatic. That is, to dramatic, intense manifestations that obey only a principle of emphasis, not of moderation. This language may speed by when you're reading the manuscript's body, but if you turn once again to Annex 2, you will find Foucault's whole vocabulary of allithurgy, manifestation, the displayed art of life, and so on. In the annex, Fabiola's kind of bodily penance is described as a great penitential rite, unique, global, concerning the whole of one's existence, and sometimes perhaps definitively changing all of one's life. This ritual relies on exploitation, that is, exploitation of the body, the brutal intensification and pushing into light of an ensemble of discontinuities. What Fabiola and others show is the very body of the sinner, the sinful body, just as the first fault has marked it, given over to death, soiled by impurities, harried by needs that it cannot satisfy. We might say Fabiola's body performs what Augustine can only describe. If Fabiola's lacerated skin disturbs you, and it is meant to disturb, I can say this more abstractly using another passage from Annex 2. Foucault calls Fabiola's style of bodily penance verification, hyphenated, that is, truth-making. He calls the contrasting penance of the verbal report veridiction, hyphenated, that is, truth-telling. He then argues that the second comes to dominate Western Christianity as juridiction, not hyphenated, but let's supply the implied hyphen to read jurisdiction, law saying. We are told that jurisdiction wins out in Christian history, but it too remains a matter of truth showing, since every verbal confession depends on a principle or a hope that showing will change things. Wordless enactments of the sin's ravages are not so far, after all, from the endless disclosure of monastic reporting. This is another distinction that cannot be a binary, at least so long as sinners remain embodied. The theater of bodily repentance draws Foucault's attention in many places. It elicits his richest vocabularies for manifestation. It also animates his imagination, his fantasy of an alternate Christianity. In some of his American lectures, Foucault describes two temptations for Christianity. One, ontological, like the bodily performance of exhomologesis. Another, epistemological, like the endless reporting of exagoreosis. What is more striking is his brief description of bodily penance. Penance is, in the first Christian centuries, is a way of life acted out at all times out of an obligation to show oneself. Way of life, obligation to show oneself. These are also Foucault's descriptions of ancient Cynic philosophers and, with some modifications, his notion of self-stylization in the 19th century. Foucault ends his Dartmouth lecture with a question. Must we still need the endless exagoreosis of forensic confession, talk therapy, the parsing of labels? Or could we imagine a way of life in which we show ourselves, to make ourselves, stylize ourselves, to become ourselves? I can't stop myself from saying that I wish that that had become the basis of gay activism rather than the notion of coming out. But I go back to the text. Could we imagine a way of life in which we show ourselves to make ourselves, stylize ourselves to become ourselves? That question, never spoken in HS4, nonetheless receives an answer in the invisible gaps of Foucault's reading of Augustine's libido. Let me end. I hope to have offered a slightly less superficial reading of Foucault on Augustine under the conceit of filling in the manuscript's invisible gaps. Does it persuade you? Do I persuade myself? I don't know. But I do claim that the volume published as HS4 is not yet a book by Michel Foucault. It is at best an assembly of drafts and paraphrases of his homework and his sketches. An attentive reader must do more than reach the last of the printed pages in order to finish this book. And doesn't Foucault describe that as the predicament of every book, whether complete or incomplete, no matter how many times revised? As he was embarked on a new plan for what would become HS4, Foucault expressed the wish that the effects of his writing might splash up in unexpected places and trace shapes that I had never thought of. And a few years earlier, immersed in confessors' manuals, those deadly confessors' manuals, he answered a question about HS1 by saying, one fictions some history on the basis of a political reality that makes it true. One fictions a politics that doesn't yet exist from a historical truth. Reader, beware. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really gorgeous. And I'm sure that my co-host here, Jim, would agree with me that that not only gave us the actual sexuality in the History of Sexuality series that we've been promising for this duration, but also a very beautiful and recursive reflection on the ways in which Foucault's own practices can be read away from systematization and towards instead the kind of ethos that you leave us with here. So as people come in with questions in the Q&A, which are invited from all in the audience and the other speakers in the series, I will see if, Jim, if you would like to chime in. I'll say very briefly that the way in which you're turning to Annex 2 and how that resonated with you, I found really striking, in part because that's the part of the text in Les Aveux that I traced back to STP, Security, Territory, Population, and also Foucault's Tanner lectures. So it's very much a 78, 79 kind of ethos on exomogesis. But then in the 84th box in the bibliothèque, I'm indulging in this practice that you told us not to do, but I'm going to indulge because it confirms your point, which is that in this 84th box in the 11th folder, this is the one that was charitable, that had Peter Brown's Augustine Sexuality in it. The very first piece of the three is a piece that is on Fabiola. It's on Tertullian. It's on Lactus Veritatis, as Philippe Chevalier was describing in an earlier iteration of Les Aveux. And so these are the materials that Foucault is working with as he is editing the draft in the last couple of months of his life. And so I think that your invitation for us to resist contexts is both so poignant, considering Foucault himself is re-engaging the work that he's returning to after about a 7-year reprieve. So I just wanted to offer that as a gift of continuity, because I think it does help illuminate what his editing practice looks like at this time, as Avril Cameron was asking about the other day, and helps us think about Foucault's own method, genealogically, historiographically, with the kind of nuance that you've described today. So I thank you.
And Nikki, if I could just add, what's truly striking to me there is the resonance of the language that reappears in his long wrestling with who and what the cynics were in ancient philosophy. This notion of the perfectly visible life, the life which is lived entirely in the theater of the public, as it were. And his moving back and forth between saying, this reveals what is implied in all of Greek philosophy. This is also the distorting mirror that shows the exaggeration of Greek philosophy. It's that language of the completely visible way of life that also seems to me to connect Annex 2 with some very late writing.
I think that's part of the ethical force that I find so compelling, at least in Foucault's work on parousia, and 84 in particular is where it's not just frank speech in 82 or speaking truth to a tyrant in 83, but really word and deed, way of life, the kind of anthem that you were describing at the close of your talk, which I think is very much the kind of ethos that I at least want to bring forward to where we are today.
Nikki, I think that statement is exquisitely accurate. That parousia has been construed almost entirely by readers as speaking truth to power is clearly a very, very limited engagement with Foucault, even though an appropriate one. If I can turn back to somewhat lexical or translational question, as I told you yesterday or in an email, Nikki, I will stop asking capital big questions. So this is a potentially pedantic question, but that fits my life academically perfectly. To Mark. Mark, you translate partage as doubling. And that's quite compelling. I endorse it, but of course, as you know, partage in French also means allotting, parceling, sharing. It has all of these other, this semantic range that is expansive, and Foucault is always doing that stuff to us, right? Using these words in French, such as regard in The Birth of the Clinic, that it's almost impossible to translate into English because of the punning, right? And the polysemy of the word itself. And I'm wondering if you can reflect, particularly because you have made such a compelling case for Foucault's refusal to construct binary oppositions, on how we might actually most accurately translate partage. I mean, this seems to me to be, among other things, compellingly, I don't know, pre-Cartesian, anti-Cartesian term that would split the body and the soul fundamentally. And as you said, we don't have the complete Foucault in the fourth volume. We get up to the 16th century, which is almost to Descartes. As you again surely know, what Foucault thought about Descartes and his debate with Derrida on the place of Descartes historically. Could we read this term? Because it really is a term, and partager, obviously the verb, as in fact registering a critique. And I hear that in your talk, but would love to hear more, registering a critique of the kind of binarism that emerges between all of these subjects you've talked about and he's talked about in the emergence of what he considers the modern period. Now, okay, that's a big question, isn't it? Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just shut up, you know, I mean, it's my problem. And Mark, just like do what you want with it. And if you don't want to do anything with it, just eject it and take on another question.
No, thank you very much. And you also allow me, I was moving very quickly. I wouldn't translate partage as double, but what I was trying to say, because I think you're right, the sense, both the lexical sense and the metaphoric range within which Foucault uses partage or partager, it means to divide. But what's interesting is that divisions often produce doublings. They beget doublings. And we see that in his account of Augustine, where the partage of the will means that libido then, as it were, in this metahistorical, mythological time, then doubles every act of human sexuality. Mm-hmm. But I think you're pointing to Descartes is very interesting, because I do think that one reason that Foucault keeps emphasizing that in Augustine, the split traverses the whole soul and body. It's a vertical split in Augustine, not a horizontal split between soul and body. So in that sense too, I think he's also saying he's got, as it were, Descartes fixed in his aim as he's describing this. And I think on that point, at least, I would defend his reading of Augustine as very astute. It's not a soul versus body division at all. The whole point of the discussion of the mimetic disobedience is precisely the unity of the soul-body composite in which the effects reverberate. But to go back to your main point, yes, I agree absolutely. Partage means division, but it's interesting then to watch the way in which divisions create or necessitate or depend on doubling. For example, in History of Madness, what it means is that reason has to create, as it were, shadow figures of the mad within its realm in order to be able to talk about them. So it has to double them as psychiatric patients. I'm mixing up the chronology now. I'm being very sloppy. But it ends up doubling them in a speech that reason can manipulate, even as it's trying to push them to the other side of the exclusion.
Marvelous. I always worry when, and I'm in no way suggesting you did this, but in fact did precisely the opposite when I encounter in an author anything that looks like a binary opposition. Again, I think you very clearly dissolved that for us in your talk. Binary oppositions are the stuff of myth. Foucault, I think, was deeply aware of the distortions and limitations and mythologizations of such sorts of oppositions. And I'm grateful to you for clarifying that for us.
Beautiful. I will follow up with a question from Gail Hamner, because this is directly on point. We can also think about dimorphism, which I know that you referenced, Mark, on 282 and Les Aveux. I think that the distinction between truth and law, vérité et droit, is an interesting way of thinking about this as not a binary of the vertical but the horizontal. So the question from Gail Hamner is, thank you for the amazing lecture. I'd be grateful to hear more about partager in light of a much more contemporary sense of sharing division, that of confessing, presenting one's life on social media. Maybe unlike Foucault's hope for a stylization that counters the binding of the subjective desire to the juridical subject, the obligation to stylize oneself on social media seems to displace and strengthen this juridical binding. That is a consequence of culture, or through consequence culture or virtue signaling. So much of our lives are now both seeable and unforeseeable in their mediatized ramifications.
Thank you, Gail. Since I don't participate in social media, I guess that would be my scandalous confession of the morning. I'm regarded by my students, especially my undergraduates, as disqualified from talking about it. But let me suggest that I think you said what would interest any Foucauldian, which is the attempt in so many ways on social media to make one's life fit within the approved scripts, whether they're scripts of advertising or what's taken to be success, or the ever multiplying social labels that are to be applied. And in that sense, I think we do need to distinguish. We need more subtle language for distinguishing the kind of manifestation of truth that he's talking about when he's talking about the cynics or Fabiola, or the convulsing nuns at Loudun, or the mad. Their manifestation of truth from what I would think of as the coerced or constrained performance of an authorized truth, in which one's body is being inducted into the official theater, as it were. And I haven't quite got any elegant way of doing that on the spot, but it does seem to me, I mean, it's exactly the point that one tries to make, that I try to make when I'm saying to my students, we have what can sound like earnest testimony of one's experience can be a script dictated down to its least comma by the prevailing power, because the prevailing power also uses earnest testimony as one of its devices. So I think I would like to work to develop a richer vocabulary for distinguishing, as it were, these prescripted, prepackaged manifestations of official truth from the other kinds of manifestation of truth that Foucault finds so interesting. And one key for me is the question of the presence of involuntary or convulsive actions of the body, which Foucault seems to take as a key to something happening beyond the official script.
I'm reminded of Damien at the beginning of Discipline and Punish, right? Verbally pious, flesh torn, reciting with great piety all of a sudden these very Christian texts, and this incitement to not only disclose who he is as a sinner, but also to disclose himself as a Christian, as a subject to the crown, as recognizing his faults. It seems like even if it's earnest, the social media injunction to continuously keep presenting ourselves in these ways is, well, part of why I've avoided it into the last 2 months to promote this series, but so goes our life. So I'm grateful in any case. I'll take Maureen Kelly's question next, because I think that we all want to know. Thank you so much for this talk. Speaking of the gaps and additional texts to think about in HS4, what do you make of Foucault's putting aside Augustine's Confessions? Does this relate to your note on the different ways that Augustine and Foucault storytell on bodies and power?
Maureen, that's a devilishly interesting question that also that also elicits a sort of private judgment I've made about Foucault's capacity as a reader of different sorts of texts in antiquity. I think, for example, Foucault is a much better reader of the Stoic pedagogical literature than he is of Plato. He is a much better reader of these elite prescriptive texts, which interest him greatly, than he is of the other modalities of the other genres that were used in ancient philosophy. And I would apply that to the choice of texts, not just in Augustine, but in Clement of Alexandria. The fact is that Clement talks about sex 3 times across his carefully constructed triad of works, the protreptic or exhortation, the pedagogos, or the person who leads you to school. And then this volume, people can't even agree if it's the 3rd volume of the series, the Stromata Stromates. Each one of them treats sex, sexual ethics. It's treated differently in each case. So what we're watching is the reappearance of a topic across a pedagogical order that is being manifest as a difference in literary genre. Let me try to say that in English. As Clement is moving through these works, what he's doing is not only varying the complexity or subtlety of the lessons he's giving about sexual ethics, he's changing his register of voice. How can Foucault read Clement and disregard the most evident feature about Clement's texts, which is this very masterful, complicated gradation of genre across the text? And I wondered the same things about the selection of Augustine. There's a curious way that Foucault, in certain moods, when Foucault is looking for sexual regulation or schemes of sexual judgment, he doesn't particularly want to have to deal with the rhetorical complexity of the text in question. And so why go to Confessions, this masterpiece of rhetorical variation, even though it is the evident place to go, at least for some of Augustine's teaching about the nature of libido. There are other famous passages on libido in On Free Choice of the Will, for example. there's a stunning description of the realm of libido, of the great river of libido, which I believe is modeled after the description of the mindless herd at the end of Plato's Republic, which ends up copulating in one another when they're not goring one another with their horns, right? Well, why not look to these for descriptions? Well, in a certain sense, it's because Foucault wants a more straightforward sort of text in order to be able to construct the logic of the image that he's after. That's at least what I would say. But to be honest, I think Foucault is a great reader of Nietzsche and a lousy reader of Plato. And maybe those always go together. I'm not sure.
It's fascinating that the Q&A at Berkeley for the Howison Lectures in 1980, Foucault directly addresses Augustine's Confessions and says how it incorporates aspects of exemogesis with Tertullian and also exegesis with the Cassian and monastics. But he says he treats the exemogesis and exegesis from these others because they have more of an effect on the institutions to come. So it seems like there's this sense that he wants to think about how do the practices become institutionalized, regulated, and become a part of disciplinary power, instead of looking at Augustine's Confessions as a privileged site for truth-telling in the way that we would expect. So there's an interesting kind of countering of expectation, but I'm really fascinated by this question, and I'm taking everything in.
And Nikki, if I could just add there, what makes it most interesting is if you think of the Tokyo lecture, where he says, if you want to understand the difference, I'm sorry, I'm simplifying and paraphrasing grotesquely, but he says, if you want to understand the difference Christianity makes, don't look at the actual prohibitions, look at the form of power, look at the form of pastoral power. But the obvious addendum to that is that the two chief forms for the exercise of pastoral power were not in spiritual direction or confession, they were in preaching and the liturgy, right? And so following Foucault's own rule, it seems to me that's where you would look.
Fascinating. If only we could have had that side. Perhaps that's what he was hinting towards when he was describing the arts of living in Christianity that he was going to pursue. I'm going to take the question from Tom Boland, if you don't mind, another one. And this gestures more towards the future. Could you say a little bit more about the practice of coming out and why it might be a problem? The relationship to exemogesis, exegesis is a tempting genealogy, perhaps alongside parousia and the cynic mode of living in public.
My asides always get me into trouble. I should know better by now. Yeah. Tom, look, the fact is, one of the parts of one set of obiter dicta of side remarks that Foucault makes that I agree with passionately and that I find very helpful are his critiques of identity, of modern sexual identities. So that when in the famous lecture that he gives at the conference of Al-Khadi, where he says, love has no passport. Identity is a matter for civil authorities. It's a matter of your identity card. It's not about your loves. It's not about the desire that flows between two bodies. I'm very interested in those remarks, especially because a lot of people have made those remarks or remarks like them over the years. Judith Butler, Eve Sedgwick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any number of eminent queer thinkers, theorists, and activists have complained about the narrowness and limitation of this model of coming out into an identity. And yet, even among people who cite these thinkers reverentially, this lesson is disregarded, right? And it's disregarded in the case of Foucault. I have students who are passionately devoted to Foucault, but when I say, and to Foucault as a guide or help in doing queer politics. But when I say, by the way, have you ever read these things that Foucault says about in critique of identity and in favor of friendship, for example? Yeah, the reaction is just sort of a blank stare, or to say, well, he got that wrong. And so I just, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. I was thinking of, I think one of the things that Foucault gets really right in HS1 and in other interviews at the time is the critique of the notion, well, it's what he refers to in HS1 as treating our sexuality as so many insect species. It's an entomologization of sexuality, he says. It's like pinning down the types of insects and putting a little label next to them. And he regards that obviously as an extension of 19th century taxonomy. And so do I.
Beautiful. One more question, if that's all right. It will be very brief, I think. This is from Thomas Renkert. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. If the notion of pastoral power of the church is linked to disciplining and neglecting one's own body, would you say that the care for bodies, e.g. in Christian diaconia, is a subversive act against hierarchical spiritual authority? So given that the pastoral power of the church is linked to disciplining and neglecting one's body, so take that one, would you say that the care for the bodies is a subversive act against spiritual authority and the hierarchy of the church?
I think it can be. We're always at risk at present in having our attempts at self-care always already co-opted by the self-care industry. That is always having genuine self-care monetized by this enormous structure. But I do agree with you. What's, I think, more important to try to wrestle with is the sense in which what looks like neglect of the body or quite severe bodily disciplines, the case of Fabiola again, the kind of cuts she inflicts on her own body because it's her beauty, which she believes has led her into sin. If we can begin to see how someone could do that out of a sense of care for the whole self, right? Then we would, I think, begin to enter in more fully to the Christian imaginary that Foucault is trying to describe. I'm not at all endorsing Fabiola's practices. I simply am saying that one of the things that Foucault is trying to understand is that for a figure like Fabiola, this public display of wounds inflicted on one's own body is an attempt to take better care of oneself than one has been taking by committing sin. Let me stop there.
That's beautiful. Any parting words then on the way in which we can think about the care of the self, thinking through bodies as sites of resistance, the way that we can resist the self-care economy, and also the that sense of really wanting to be earnest in the formation of one's life without it being a function of power or a function of capitalism.
Here, I would just pick up something that Jim Fabian said at the very beginning, with which I agree strongly, which is one of the reasons I have never found periodizations of Foucault's work to be very convincing is that it seems to me certain questions run right through. And one of the most illuminating essays that I think he wrote on the body seen, as it were, in theological light, not ascetical light, but theological light, is his essay on Pierre Klossowski from the 60s, where he tries to imagine, he says Klossowski is presenting to us in his novels a picture of human existence that we long ago lost with modern Christianity. And if we can hear Klossowski, then we begin to hear this ancient voice of Christianity. Yes, so that would be, I I think this concern with the body runs right through from the 50s right up to his death.
Beautiful.
Thank you all. Thank you all for putting up with my voice. I'm happy to take further questions, corrections, remonstrances, calls to arm at my email address. So thanks to you all.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really exquisite. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, bye-bye.